In the mornings, the streets of Paris resembled a living price list of honor. The collar and neckline revealed how much you were worth to the state. The width of the lace, the height of the stand-up collar, the depth of the neckline, the length of the train, the number of feathers in the hat, all this had long ceased to be a matter of taste. It had become a document of status. On paper, they wrote about modesty and order in clothing. But in reality, adults walked around the city with measuring sticks, notebooks, and the authority to turn an extra inch of velvet into a fine. Honor by the collar, wallet by the neckline. This was the daily anatomy of power under Valois. Hello, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Write to us about where you are watching this story from, and which stories about control over appearance and clothing seem most disturbing and demonstrably unfair to you. I wish you a peaceful but attentive listening experience. Now let's see how the words about the fight against luxury and debauchery hid completely different goals: control over status, money, and those who made money from fabric and scissors. In the French ordinances of the late Valois, clothing became not just a habit, but a legal category. Lists approved on behalf of the king specified who was allowed to wear gold on fabric, who was entitled to a certain width of fur trim, and what feathers and stones an adult of a particular class could claim. Some provisions directly prohibited ordinary townspeople from wearing silk stockings or velvet cloaks. Others limited the length of women's trains, the depth of necklines, and the number of slits in sleeves. On paper, there were formulas about restraint, appropriate rank, and preventing excess. But nearby, in the penalty books, completely different figures were recorded. The amounts that townspeople and the petty nobility paid for the right to violate or circumvent this system. These same documents mention the figure of the inspector. This is not a fairy tale guardian of morals, but a grown man with the authority to stop people on the street, measure the length of their sleeves, estimate the cost of the fabric by eye, and record the violation. His power is based on ambiguity. The laws are written in general terms, and it is up to him to apply them. One extra row of buttons, an extra strip of fur, a neckline that is too daring in his opinion, and you can already add your name to the list of debtors. For people who make a living from their craft, this means constant risk. An order that satisfies the customer can turn into a fine on the same day. According to legend, sumptuary laws were supposed to curb debauchery and luxury. The myth tells of kings who allegedly tried to protect the morals of their subjects from the temptation of spectacular clothing, of caring for the poor, who should not be irritated by the excesses of the rich. But if you look deeper into the texts of the ordinances and the accounting of fines, a different picture emerges. The prohibitions clearly mark the boundary between those who have the right to look superior and those who are supposed to remain visually modest. Clothing becomes a visual passport of social class, and anyone who tries to forge this passport with the help of fabric is punished. Under Valois, this is especially noticeable in cities, where the wealthy bourgeoisie is growing. They can afford silk, fur, and expensive lace according to their wallet, but not always according to the law. Lists of offenders show adult merchants, craft guild leaders, notaries, and their wives being fined for resembling people of higher rank in their clothing. The wording sounds like moral condemnation, but in essence it reflects the anxiety of the old nobility. If anyone who has become wealthy can look like a nobleman, then the visual system of distinctions ceases to function. The ordinances become an attempt to cement the distance between those born into a certain class and those who have approached it through money. At court, meanwhile, things are even more cynical. Those who supply the royal household with fabrics, furs, lace, and feathers understand perfectly well the price of every letter in the ordinances. Court suppliers and court tailors are interested in ensuring that some luxuries are available only through them. If an ordinance prohibits a certain type of decoration to all except those who have explicit royal permission, it means that anyone who wants to stand out is forced to seek a way to obtain this permission through those who are closer to the throne. Words about modesty become a tool of monopoly. Certain fabrics, styles, and decorations become a privilege that can be given and taken away. This is also evident in internal conflicts within the craft industry. Tailors, milliners, embroiderers, and hairdressers live under double pressure. The customer demands fashion, a long train, a high collar, an elaborate hairstyle with decorations. The law demands moderation. If a craftsman fulfills the customer's wishes too literally, he risks a fine or even a temporary ban on work. If he is too cautious, he will lose the customer, who will go to a more daring craftsman. The archives of city courts record complaints from craftsmen about the arbitrary interpretation of ordinances by inspectors. One inspector considers the same style acceptable, while another considers it grounds for punishment. The situation is particularly difficult for those who work directly with the body, barbers and hairdressers. Sumptuary laws apply not only to clothing, but also to hair, beards, and headwear. The depth of a neckline, the height of a hairstyle, the length of curls, all these elements can be recorded as inappropriate adornment. When an inspector enters a salon, every adult client and every stylist is at risk. In some cases, the client is fined. In others, the stylist who contributed to the violation. As a result, it is precisely those who earn their living from this controlled appearance who are most dependent on the people with the measuring stick. Underneath the talk of humility lies a very material system. The amounts received from violators are carefully recorded in penalty books. This money goes to the city treasury to pay officials, to those who participate in inspections. The more flexible the interpretation of the concept of excess, the more reasons there are for fines. Therefore, in practice, laws that are supposedly designed to curb luxury become a source of steady income for the tax authorities. An adult who once allowed himself an extra element of clothing may pay for years for attempting to visually rise above his place in the class hierarchy. The myth of the fight against debauchery is based on sermons and moralistic texts. There, clothing is always linked to morality. A neckline that is too low allegedly leads to debauchery. Fabric that is too rich leads to pride. And colors that are too bright lead to a violation of order. But in documents that count, how many times a woman was stopped for the width of her sleeves, or a man for forbidden fur on his collar, a different logic is heard. Here, it is not so much the supposed inner purity that is important as the outward conformity to one's class. A person can lead a quiet, austere life and still be fined for lace that they could afford, but did not have the level for. The subjects themselves quickly learn this ambiguity. A shadow culture of circumventing sumptuary laws emerges in the cities. Some order clothes made of prohibited fabrics, but dye them in less conspicuous colors. Others hide expensive jewelry under cloaks, revealing it only in safe spaces. Some negotiated with specific inspectors who turned a blind eye to certain details in exchange for an unofficial fee. Thus, modesty in dress did not result in the actual elimination of luxury, but rather in a market of small privileges and partial exceptions where every adult could buy a little more right to visibility. Against this backdrop, the protests of artisans seem to be an attempt to defend not so much morality as professional autonomy. Tailors and hairdressers complain that the laws are written by people who are far removed from practice and are applied by those who do not understand the technology well. They point out that the true value of clothing is determined not by the width of the collar, but by the quality of the fabric and labor, and that sumptuary measures strike at craftsmanship, not pretentiousness. But their voices rarely reach those who write the ordinances. There they look not at the real work, but at symbols, at ensuring that every adult body is wrapped in a strictly defined sign of status. It is in this system that the gap between myth and document becomes apparent. The myth says that the Valois tried to stop debauchery and excess with dress laws. The documents show consistent work to reinforce class boundaries, organize a steady stream of fines, and maintain the privileges of those who decide who is allowed to wear certain signs of luxury. Modesty in dress turns out to be not about virtue, but about control. Control over the body, over the wallet, over visibility in the city crowd. And the more neatly the collar is sewn, the clearer it is to see whose hands are holding the measure. At the court level, sumptuary ordinances were never born out of pure morality. Around Valois there was a tight circle of suppliers, officials, and court craftsmen who understood that any clothing standard could become a filter for money. Bans on certain fabrics and trimmings secured the most expensive orders for those who already had access to the royal household. Formulas about modesty and order covered up a simple task: to prevent wealthy townspeople and provincial nobles from visually approaching the old nobility and giving their money to the wrong merchants. Ordinances were issued in series supplemented, and confused. One document limited the length of trains for adult women of a certain origin. Another prohibited trimmings for those who did not belong to the upper class. And a third reminded of the inadmissibility of excessively open necklines. As a result, inspectors in cities were given almost free rein. City magistrates collected fines and demonstrated their zeal for the crown, while the blow fell on those who lived by their craft: tailors, dyers, and fabric merchants. Every overly bold fashion choice became a risk of losing not only money, but also customers. Tailors and hairdressers found themselves in direct conflict with this system. Their earnings depended on their customers' desire to stand out, but any noticeable detail could be considered a violation. Guild records contain complaints that inspectors measure by eye. One inspector may approve a sleeve, while another may find the same design. Craftsmen were punished along with their customers, and the craft gradually learned to hide luxury in small details. Removable elements, decorations that could be taken off before going out, and styles that could be quickly simplified if necessary. Officially, the law demanded modesty. In practice, forcing adults to live in constant calculation. How dangerous every centimeter of fabric was. Religious rhetoric intensified the pressure. Preachers associated lavish dresses, high hairstyles, and necklines not only with pride but also with a threat to public order itself. Against the backdrop of wars, epidemics, and taxes, it was convenient to claim that misfortunes came from the excesses of the subjects. But the lists of fines show something else. Those who crossed the status line were punished first and foremost, not those who truly challenged modesty. Collars, trains, and the amount of jewelry became a measure of class. Debauchery meant not abandoned chastity, but an attempt by a wealthy townsman to look like a nobleman. The more complaints accumulated about the arbitrariness of inspectors and corruption, the more the authorities were forced to bring order at least to the control system itself. New ordinances attempted to establish fixed fines, prescribe who had the right to measure clothing, and how to appeal against excessive zeal on the part of the inspector. This did not negate the goal of maintaining a visible, hierarchical order based on clothing, but it did turn honor by the collar into a more formalized mechanism. Modesty is still measured by fabric and neckline, but instead of pure arbitrariness, standards and appeals are increasingly used to reduce the number of elbows by eye and keep control over status and money in the same hands. Control over clothing increasingly became a constant source of conflict between the real economy and court morality. Suppliers of fabrics and furs understood that each new ban created artificial demand. If commoners were forbidden to wear a certain color or type of trim, then all trade in this commodity was restricted to those who could officially afford it. Therefore, invisible markets of influence formed around the royal ordinances. Some craftsmen sought exemptions for their products, while others bribed officials to ease restrictions on fabrics imported from certain regions. At the same time, irritation grew among the city's guilds. Tailors openly complained that they were being asked to do the impossible, to sew a dress that would make the customer look dignified, but not too expensive, to comply with regulations that changed every year, to ensure that the inspector did not decide that their work was too courtly for the middle class. Fearing fines, craftsmen reduced their range of products, lost customers, and tried to read ordinances in the same way they read court texts, looking for ambiguities so as not to make mistakes. Although on paper, the laws were aimed at combating pride, the records of city magistrates show otherwise. Most of the punishments were imposed on those who tried to climb the social ladder. Wealthy artisans were fined for wearing fur trim. Merchants' widows were fined for wearing sleeves that were too long. Merchants' adult daughters were fined for wearing jewelry that was considered perfectly acceptable in another neighborhood. The debauchery that preachers spoke of most often meant nothing more than that a person was not dressed according to their prescribed rank. But it was around these fines that a separate economy grew. Inspectors received a share of the fines, guilds faced the threat of losing their privileges, and officials gained the opportunity to intervene in private disputes. Clothing became not a reflection of taste, but a document of belonging. Every collar, every brooch, every layer of fabric turned an adult's body into a social passport. And the higher the tension rose between the townspeople and the regulatory authorities, the clearer it became. This was not about morality, but about preserving the old hierarchy, which was now measured not by the sword and kinship, but by the length of the train and the price of the fur. The townspeople tried to resist quietly. Some ordered double dresses, where the top layer could be easily removed when an inspector appeared. Others created a fashion for simpler fabrics to emphasize taste rather than status. Still others negotiated with tailors for hidden seams that allowed them to change the silhouette without breaking the law. These little tricks left their mark in the accounting books. Strange phrases such as dress with hidden elements or lining that can be removed if necessary appeared. The law demanded modesty, but life demanded flexibility. It was during this period that the most influential suppliers to the court began to interfere in the wording of new ordinances. They did not speak openly, but their interests could be guessed from the details. To ban cheap fabrics that resembled expensive ones, to restrict access to dyes imported from abroad, to reserve certain styles for the highest nobility. What was called moral protection became a private market mechanism. Modesty in dress became a tool for controlling not bodies, but who was allowed to earn money and how one could appear in the eyes of the authorities. In cities, disputes between artisans and officials flared up more and more often because the sumptuary laws were becoming too complicated to enforce. Tailors complained that each inspector interpreted the rules in his own way. One considered a certain color unacceptable, another the width of the sleeves, and a third the number of folds in the collar. For craftsmen, this became a constant risk. An order for a gray dress could result in a fine if an inspector decided that the fabric looked too rich. Because of this, people increasingly turned to city courts, and cases began to appear in the records where it was not the style itself that was discussed, but the arbitrariness of those who evaluated the style. Seeing the growing discontent, the Paris authorities tried to unify control under a single formula: modesty according to class. But this formula only exacerbated the chaos. Now inspectors had to determine not the length of the train, but how well a person corresponded to their place in society. For artisans, this became a trap. Clothing had to show wealth in order to attract customers, but not so much as to arouse suspicion. It was then that tailors and hairdressers began to form informal unions, trying to develop their own set of rules to protect themselves from the whims of the authorities. However, the problem ran deeper. Competing interests emerged within the control system itself. Some inspectors sought to expand their powers, while others tried to reduce pressure on cities to avoid unrest. Volitional functions began to depend on personal ambitions and corrupt connections. Several investigations recorded cases where inspectors declared a shift forbidden in order to receive a bribe for mercy. Such episodes rarely became public, but their traces are visible in the accounting books. The incomes of individual supervisors suddenly increased, and fines grew rapidly and unevenly. At the same time, there was growing resentment among women, who were more affected than others by the new controls. They were responsible for representing the house through their appearance, and it was their clothing that was most often subject to inspection. Diaries and letters contain complaints from adult women who were forced to hide trimmings or order different versions of the same dress for different occasions. The system, proclaimed for the sake of morality, effectively turned women's wardrobes into a field of bureaucratic risk. A mistake in the choice of fabric could lead to public humiliation and financial punishment. At this point, tailors and jewelry makers began to openly resist. They submitted collective petitions demanding that the rules be clearly formulated and not depend on the inspector's discretion. Their arguments sounded like an accusation. If the authorities punish people for buying fabrics that they themselves have permitted, then the problem is not one of morality, but of a desire to keep artisans dependent. These petitions were not always accepted, but they created pressure that forced the royal administration to revise the instructions given to its supervisors. It was then that a new motif appeared in the documents: complaints from cities tired of the fact that control over clothing distracted people from real problems: disease, taxes, and bread shortages. Magistrates noted that inspectors began to walk the streets more often than tax collectors. One record notes that in 1 month, more fines were imposed for inappropriate clothing than for violations of trade regulations. This made the authorities' priorities too obvious. There was a growing feeling that the system of sumptuary laws had grown not for the sake of order, but for the sake of those who lived off it. And the louder the talk of protecting morals became, the more obvious it became that this control was based not on morality, but on money. The cost of fabric, the number of fines, the inspector's share. For adults living within this machine, modesty in dress became a mandatory language of submission, rather than a virtue. Over time, the accumulated complaints began to change the very structure of control. Petitions poured into the office from city magistrates, craft guilds, and individual families, and these papers spoke less and less about morality and more about arbitrariness. Magistrates wrote about adult craftsmen who were ruined by fines for fabric purchased from court suppliers, about widows who lost their last dress because an inspector considered the ribbon or trim to be excessive, about tailors who refused to take orders so as not to take risks. In response, the royal administration was forced to do what it had not originally planned: introduce standards described not by sermons, but by measures. More detailed ordinances appeared, which finally attempted to establish specific parameters: the length of the train, the width of the sleeves, the type of collar, and the permissible number of decorations, depending on social class. There were different limits for nobles, townspeople, and craftsmen. All this was accompanied by tables of fines, where each violation was assigned an amount to be paid by the offender and a share going to the inspector. The few surviving lists show how petty it was. Separate fines were imposed for excessive decoration on a hat, for fabric considered too thin for a given class, and for a collar that exceeded the prescribed height. At the same time, appeal procedures were introduced. Townspeople and craftsmen were given the formal right to complain about the actions of inspectors to the city council or to a special court at the court. The minutes of these proceedings contain cases where punishments were found to be excessive, where inspectors were caught exceeding their authority or demanding bribes for leniency. Sometimes such people were dismissed, sometimes simply transferred to another position. But the very fact that appeals were being lodged showed that the system was causing too much irritation to be left without safeguards. It is telling that in some cities the initiative came not only from the victims, but also from the tailors themselves. They insisted on working with government officials to approve acceptable clothing designs for different social classes. Documents describe meetings where adult craftsmen argued with officials about the width of sleeves, the number of folds, and the shape of collars. For tailors, this was not only a professional issue, but also a way to protect themselves from accusations of corrupting the costume. If the style was approved jointly, it was more difficult for the inspector to declare it a violation and impose a fine. Gradually, the ordinances began to contain fewer calls to curb debauchery and more formulas for maintaining order and distinguishing between social classes. In practice, this meant that the language of morality with which they began now served as a backdrop, and the essence boiled down to stabilizing visible social differences. Fabrics, feathers, and neckline height became markers of rank, and control over them became a tool for managing envy and anxiety within society. If a merchant is forbidden to wear what a nobleman is allowed to wear, this reduces the risk that his wealth will be perceived as an open challenge. At the same time, the authorities gradually recognized that too much room for subjective assessment was destroying the system itself. New instructions required inspectors to rely not on their personal sense of propriety, but on approved samples and lists. There are still references to how special summary lists were created for this purpose. What fabrics and decorations were allowed for each class, what styles were considered acceptable. This was not yet a modern technical standard, but it was a step away from eyeballing to a more predictable set of rules. For people living under this control, the changes felt like both a relief and a reminder of boundaries. On the one hand, it became possible to understand in advance what outfit would not cause problems, what decorations were acceptable at a wedding or celebration, and where the permissible display of wealth ended. On the other hand, it became clear that clothing was no longer simply a personal choice. It became part of an administrative grid where any element could be read as a statement of status and therefore as a reason for intervention. And yet, even in this well-oiled machine, there were cracks. Holidays, masquerades, and private gatherings at court regularly became zones of temporary relaxation of restrictions, where adult men and women allowed themselves to go beyond the rules. These episodes were rarely recorded in documents, but they are reminiscent of descriptions of court festivities, intricate fabrics, luxurious trimmings, feathers, and decorations that clearly exceeded the norms. This revealed a familiar contradiction. Those who created and supported the system of modesty in dress themselves demonstratively violated it from time to time, showing that for them the rules remained primarily a tool for controlling others. Over time, the myth of sumptuary laws took root in a convenient form. Supposedly, the authorities were fighting debauchery, saving society from moral decay, and keeping people from excessive luxury. In this picture, officials appear as guardians of morality, and subjects as those who need to be protected from their own temptations. But the documents remaining in the archives reveal a colder truth. The ordinances and lists of fines show that the main focus was not on specific sins, but on the visible hierarchy, the cost of fabrics, and the distribution of the right to display wealth. The supervisors themselves, living off a share of the fines, became professional status controllers rather than guardians of morality. Their interests were tied to finding violations, not to making society truly more modest. Court suppliers used fear of prohibitions to sell permitted splendor. Tailors and hairdressers learned to balance orders and risks, and women became living showcases of family reputation on which new forms of control were tested. The ending of this story offers no relief. Sumptuary laws did not disappear along with individual ordinances. They dissolved into the habit of reading clothing as a document and the body as a surface for marking rank. Honor by the collar, modesty by the length of the sleeve, propriety by the thickness of the fabric became the everyday language in which the authorities spoke to their subjects without words. The myth spoke of the fight against debauchery. The papers remaining in the archives show something else: a multi-tiered system of regulating status and money, where fabric and feathers were used as measures of loyalty, and modesty in dress became a form of submission that was almost impossible to evade.